Money never sleeps, pal.
Hey there, I'm Pete Townsend, and this is Money Never Sleeps. We look inside the minds of entrepreneurs and at the crossover of startups, enterprise, finance, technology, and life as we know it. Before we get started, just a heads up that ETH Dublin is back again to bring Ireland on chain, with a hackathon and conference is May 23rd to 25th. And yes, Ethereum co-founder Vitalik Buterin and Aave's founder and CEO Stani Kulichov are both confirmed to speak. It's shaping up to be a pretty fantastic crypto weekend here in Dublin, and absolutely one not to miss. This week, I'm welcoming back a guest who absolutely lit up our first conversation in January of last year, Simon Brown from Consensys. Back then, we dove deep into the over-centralization of crypto, and Simon gave me a whole new perspective on what was really going on under the hood in the Ethereum ecosystem.
Money never sleeps, pal.
Now, Simon's role at Consensys has evolved, and he's now leading the charge on a new initiative called the Consensys Network State. It's all about reconnecting the sprawl of the Ethereum ecosystem, reinforcing the cultural gravity that made Ethereum magical in the first place, and creating a more cohesive network of builders, founders, and ecosystem experts. Today, we're digging into how this initiative is setting the stage for Ethereum's next decade, how it's bridging gaps between projects and people, and what it means for the future of decentralized coordination. We also get into some big picture thinking about the evolution of Ethereum, the rise of network states, and what it takes to keep that cultural gravity intact as Ethereum continues to grow. So let's jump right back in with Simon Brown from Consensys, all right here on Money Never Sleeps.
Listen, Simon, great to have you back on the show. Thanks for joining me again.
Yeah, thanks, Pete. It's great to be back.
Awesome. When we did our last chat back in January of 2024, last year, that was really eye-opening for me. So thank you for that first chat. Now I'm looking forward to kind of going in a little bit of a different direction this time. So before we do that, can you just get the listeners caught up on how things evolved for you with your role with Consensys since we last chatted in January of 2024?
So, what's happened since then? Well, a lot. At the time, I was working with Linea a lot. I think in Consensys, it was generally speaking all hands on deck trying to get Linea off the ground. And I'd spent a good deal of time working on Linea's decentralization. So figuring out technically how to decentralize the sequencer, the prover, all of the various different options, looking at how the ecosystem was evolving, base rollups, pre-confirmations, all that kind of stuff. But then around November, around DevCon last year, Consensys really kind of pivoted its long-term strategy around, where it was going as a company. And Joe has this vision for really decentralizing Consensys itself. So my role changed from being like a researcher more to strategy. And I took on the role of leading the Consensys Network State group. And it's really about figuring out how that looks like, how we decentralize Consensys, how we tap into the huge diaspora that Consensys has built over the past 10 years of building Ethereum, how we actually create a robust network where people can really support each other and grow. And so it's a very ambitious vision, very exciting, very glad to be working on it.
When you and I first met and understanding your role as a researcher and then now shifting into a strategy role, was that a major mindset shift for you, or was that something that was just a natural next step?
It was kind of a natural next step because all of my research had been supporting product strategy anyway. So it had kind of a strategic focus. And I think most senior product managers, they kind of do a lot of research themselves, but they need someone to kind of specialize in certain areas that are very complex. And that's what I was doing. So moving into a strategy role was sort of made sense, but it is a huge domain, like go build a network state, that was a tough one to break down, but we've made some really good progress.
Okay. And network state, what comes to mind is Balaji Srinivasan wrote a book called Network State. His proposal was that, listen, we can build a state, a nation state that is network-based.
Interestingly enough, that was my first starting point when thinking about this. Like knowing nothing about network states and trying to get my head around it, the first thing I did was read Balaji's book. And it was interesting, but subsequently I learned that a lot of the things, the concepts that he discussed have actually been around for a long time. Quite a long time, actually. The further down the rabbit hole I went, the more I learned that actually there's nothing new here. And there's been these sort of parallel societies based on global diasporas for actually quite a long time. And you can draw parallels between all sorts of things, like everything from the Freemasons to Zionism to the Armenian diaspora. But I think in the context of like a digital first network nation, network sovereignty, whatever you want to call it, that's new, right? It's in the context of this post-globalized, hyper-connected digital society. What can we imagine? And what we can imagine is quite exciting. And so I think the idea of network states, while it's still confusing, and there's probably a whole bunch of different definitions, it's starting to enter the common vernacular a lot more. And I think people are starting to think about the possibilities a lot more, which is exciting.
It is exciting. It is exciting. Now, we're going to get into the Consensys Network State in a minute and what you're doing with that. But what you shared with me, Simon, really got me thinking. There was an excellent one-liner in your description of the Consensys Network State that really summed it up for me quite well. That you said Ethereum has grown so much that it is struggling to hold together the cultural gravity that made it magical. Right? Cultural gravity really struck me. Almost like a city that has undergone urban sprawl and is trying to hold on to its identity as a city. Can you talk a bit about the context of how Ethereum can hold its cultural gravity together? What's the objective here?
That's actually quite a good analogy. A city that's undergone urban sprawl and is kind of struggling to maintain that coherence. I think that sums it up pretty well. I mean, a lot of people are quite negative about Ethereum at the moment. To me, the challenges that Ethereum faces are really just symptomatic of its maturity as an ecosystem. And any other ecosystem that has grown to the huge extent that Ethereum has grown, both economically, in terms of the use cases and the amount of value on it, would experience the same problems. You couldn't say it's growing pains, but it's definitely a symptom of its success. And I think when you look at kind of the conversations that are taking place, you can see certain topics that tend to emerge. So one of them is quite clearly about the value of ETH, right? People are always talking about the price of ETH. And that's an interesting kind of nuanced topic. Is ETH the asset central to the identity? Is that what provides this sort of like cultural cohesion between all of the different participants and actors in the ecosystem? Or is it something that people are just obsessed with, like the number go up? And maybe it's just that trivial. I think it's more nuanced. And I think it's a very interesting conversation. And I think we do need to think about the price of ETH and acknowledge that economic alignment and cultural shared values are kind of two sides of the same coin. And so it is an interesting conversation. As Sean Ryan Adams actually articulates it very well. And he talks about, what does he call it? The United Chains of Ethereum, which I think Justin Drake originally coined that phrase. But he talks about how ETH, the asset, is kind of culturally important. And so I think, that is an interesting conversation. It's not the only one, I think there's various other topics that emerge when you talk about like the implications of the pivot to the roll-up centric roadmap. And now we have all of these different L2s, and like economically and culturally, Ethereum seems fragmented. Again, there's a lot of nuance to that conversation, but it's certainly, I can see both sides of the argument. And also just in terms of shared values, like what does it mean? Like what do we hold as important? I remember seeing the word like wartime used by people talking about like, we have to win, we have to be the best. Oh, look, Solana are stealing our thunder. It brought up some very interesting questions about like, what does Ethereum stand for and what do we hold important? And how do we balance our ideals with pragmatism? And I saw a lot of kind of soul searching, if I'm honest. And so like you could take any three of those topics, you could spend a day talking about them. They don't make me bearish for Ethereum, quite the opposite. I think, seeing how the conversations are played out and the results from those conversations and what's happening in the ecosystem makes me more bullish than ever on Ethereum.
Yeah. And to me, it's important to distinguish, like you said, between ETH, the asset, and Ethereum as a network, as a community, as an ecosystem, as the OG. There's two different conversations here. There is the token, the coin, the asset. And however people may view that on a short to medium term basis, I've become over the years agnostic to that. I still hold ETH because I believe in where it's going. And I believe in the journey and the mission. And that is what it was a critical point for me in my own development in this space back in 2014, where I read the Bitcoin white paper first. And yes, a bit late in the game for that from where it came from, but then it was just very lucky with the timing of when the ETH white paper came out. And that, for me, from my point of discovery and learning about Bitcoin and the possibilities of blockchain. And then I saw Ethereum take it to a whole new level. I'm like, whoa. And that's been the trajectory that I think, I'm not going to say the entire space has been on, but Ethereum has made so much of this possible. And that is all still there, and it's undergone metamorphosis over the last few years. Do I have this right from an outsider's view, or is there a lot more going on behind the scenes within the community, right?
Within the community, there has been, I think, a lot of soul searching, and there has been a lot of what is our North Star? What are we aiming for? And I think there's been a lot of arguing, to be perfectly honest. I think it's really healthy, because what you're actually seeing practically coming out of that are real innovations and real things that are happening. Take even like this 24-hour period, right? We have the Pectra upgrade going live in about an hour. Huge amounts of innovations in there. Everything from inclusion lists to like EIPs for account abstraction, PeerDAS, like really pushing Ethereum forward. Yesterday, there was an announcement from Flashbots and BeaverBuild that BeaverBuild, who built something like 40% of Ethereum blocks, they're moving over to Flashbots BuilderNet. So they're decentralizing a lot of the building infrastructure, removing a huge choke point for centralization. Again, there's other technological innovations happening all the time. So there's an argument to be made, would there be that much technological innovation if there wasn't this kind of competition between different perspectives, if there wasn't the lack of complacency that we have? Maybe not, you know? So I think there is really like making great strides all the time. And when you see this amount of innovation happening, you know, we're 10 years into the Ethereum project. I think it's like June 30th is the anniversary of the Genesis block. And 10 years later, it's still going strong. It's still innovating. It's still pushing the boundaries. So the next 10 years, you know, shows no signs of slowing down. So yeah, in the long run, I think Ethereum is very, it's a really good place.
It's so crazy is that some of the tendencies here are to think about any blockchain ecosystem, any blockchain community as a centralized company, as a centralized corporation. And the media and people in general just will tend to look at that and say, I'm looking at that as if I would look at, okay, I'm hearing about stuff happening in NVIDIA, or I'm hearing about stuff happening in Microsoft. But it's not that. It's different.
There is this intractable tension between like decentralized polycentric governance and a very centralized and efficient system. Say, for example, institutions coming to Ethereum, who do they talk to? Do they talk to the EF? Do they talk to Consensys? Do they talk to Etherealize, you know? And like the governance of Ethereum, I think, you know, it's while it can always be improved, I think it strikes a healthy balance, but it can be quite opaque. And it can be kind of difficult to make decisions. And yeah, that comes with the territory when you have a really decentralized system.
It does. It does. And, you know, the longer term view will be the one that wins out. On the Consensys Network State, digging into that a bit, can you give us some insight as to how you expect that to unfold?
There are a couple of different perspectives on it. The Consensys Network State aims to be a sort of like connective tissue between companies, collectives, communities who want to build on Ethereum. So ultimately, it's about empowering people that want to build on Ethereum by providing tools and infrastructure that Consensys has developed over the years, as well as tapping into the broad network that Consensys has built over the years as well. And it's important not to understate the impact that Consensys has traditionally had on Ethereum. Consensys really did help to build Ethereum in the early years, and the diaspora is enormous. So it's really about tapping into that network in a way that the participants can help to support each other. So we are looking at various different coordination tools for around using AI agents for discovery, for networking, to kind of form this connective tissue between different organizations so that they can provide support for each other. We're not the only ones thinking about this. I think there are a number of ecosystems that are kind of thinking similarly. So I'm thinking in terms of like Arbitrum recently started using the nomenclature of building like a network state or a network nation, thinking very much along the same lines about connecting kind of Arbitrum aligned entities with each other. I think Protocol Labs is another example that have been arguably pioneering this sort of network of aligned entities. So that's one aspect of the Consensys Network State, but it's also about making consensus more porous. I think Joe's vision was never to be like a company, it was to be like an ecosystem that helped to support Ethereum. And so giving people the ability to join Consensys, to join the network and participate, with various other teams and organizations is part of it as well. And so we're looking at various different ways to do that. But ultimately, it's about empowering people to build on Ethereum. I suppose that's the tagline, right? The North Star.
And any insight as to kind of connecting some of those dots, right? Like, so take my example, and we've talked a bit about this before, Simon, is that we've brought 4 classes through the Techstars Web3 Accelerator, 40 companies or projects that have come through that. We probably have another 60 that have gone through other Techstars programs in Web3, and then probably another 200 on top of that would be considered to be Web3 adjacent. So I can start with a 40 and connect the dots between them, between myself and Hugh McGurr, who runs Techstars Web3 program with me, and then extend that out a bit to the additional 60 beyond that. But once you get beyond 100 projects or companies, that becomes quite a bit of an undertaking. And it's almost like you said, that it's not about being that central focal point. It's about being the bridge. And it's about allowing these interactions to take place and allowing people to learn from each other and build with each other, perhaps, and taking advantage of this diaspora, as you mentioned. I love that word. Can you talk about the types of things to connect the communities and to build the bridges?
As you pointed out, like once you kind of get beyond that Dunbar number of like 100 to 150 people, it starts to kind of break down and it gets very hard to scale. So what we're looking at is kind of like, how do you scale it using technology? So there's various different things that we're looking at. One of them is looking at reputation. I'm very lucky to have on my team a very experienced enterprise architect who previously worked for MetaMask, building out a reputation technology layer for the distribution of snaps. And so they stood up a prototype which worked really well and allowed people to just list snaps without any gatekeeper, but in a way that was safe for people to decide whether or not to install them, right? And so this was based on this kind of peer-to-peer subjective reputation system, and we're bringing that forward and developing it further to try to like scale the introductions and discoverability and networking features, because it gets very difficult when like you need an introduction to somebody, you have to find the person who knows the person to, it doesn't scale very well. So that's one approach we're taking. Another approach is we are thinking about agreements and going back to first principles and trying to imagine how agreements are made between people and between organizations. When you look at Web3 right now, you've got incredible innovation, but to get anything off the ground, like you still need to go back to lawyers, right? 90% of agreements involve legal professionals and ink on paper. And the legal profession, its bread and butter is like understanding how these agreements work, understanding the workflows, having this kind of like arsenal of workflows that they understand really well. And that's fine, but we're thinking about how disintermediation of Web3 and crypto can be applied to just agreements so that people can make agreements between each other really easily without centralized gatekeepers in a way that they can just like make the agreement and then get to work and build. So one of the first things we did was have been doing a lot of work with the SOBOL team, who are kind of legendary in the DAO space. They've been working in the DAO space for about since 2017. And this year, they built a novel agreements protocol that we've just launched. It's at signet.build. And so this agreement protocol is like, how do we make this really efficient, really simple, really easy for developers to create agreements? How do we curate agreements so that people know like which one is actually robust and trustworthy, has been battle tested in the real world? Again, back to the reputation system, and then really efficiently get to work and solve a lot of the problems that most founders and builders don't even realize that they're going to encounter when they set up. We feel that will help to scale the kind of networking and connections between people.
One of the concepts I've been working on recently as well, Simon, is this, building and scaling Web3 by having this connective tissue back to Web2 and having the Web2 champions and leaders out there have already embraced where we're going with Web3. And saying, yes, there are strong elements that they need to adopt and bring into their business. We're going to have this gap for a while.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm glad that you brought up like Web2 companies, right? Because again, the CNS and the wider ecosystem, I think, is starting to orient toward how do we make Ethereum relevant in people's everyday lives? And I was actually very heartened to see this statement from Aya and Vitalik recently from the EFs saying that the twin goals of the EF, like one of them is about the usage of Ethereum and the other one is about like maintaining the decentralization. But with regards to the usage of Ethereum, they stated that the primary goal was to make Ethereum useful such that people everywhere benefited directly from it. And directly, as opposed to, indirectly via their institutions that they may have their mortgage or their loan or their pension or whatever. Instead of institutions adopting Ethereum and then people indirectly adopting Ethereum, it's like directly in people's lives in terms of community initiatives, crowdfunding, lending, payment invoicing, etc. So like these use cases are incredibly important to the future of Ethereum. Otherwise, like what was it all for? But in order to get there, there's a lot of work to be done. And I think, this agreement is a perfect example in terms of like what founders need to do to get off the ground, in terms of like incorporation, in terms of like billing invoices, in terms of like creating agreements with other organizations, agreements between the different members, managing the cap table. Yep. It just goes on. And all of that is currently, behind legal professionals who really understand where the gotchas are. So I think going to ChatGPT isn't enough.
No.
You need complex workflows. There's like the way we actually looked at agreements when we actually got into the details, we realized, well, actually Vic in Sobol, who's an exceptional engineer, realized that all agreements are basically this deterministic finite state machine that has all of these conditional branches and stuff. And it's basically like an arcane form of coding, right? So in that respect, there is a way to actually simplify the whole process using technology and make it much more efficient and much more accessible for people.
Oh, yeah. I worked with a startup years ago who was like, we need to take legal documents, put them into the top of the machine, and out the bottom of the machine becomes plain English language that people can understand. It's awesome to hear about the momentum that you're driving on this because it's well needed. You mentioned ETH, the Ethereum Foundation. And obviously, there's the Ethereum community and the governance around that. There's the Ethereum Foundation and Consensys. Your positioning within all that, obviously, you're coming at this from a consensus perspective with Consensys Network State. But how do you then connect the dots with the Ethereum Foundation and the wider Ethereum governance community?
Yeah, that's an interesting question, especially in, against the backdrop of kind of the reform that we've seen in the Ethereum Foundation. And now we have these two very talented directors that are leading the EF. And I've worked with Tomas in the past, and he is, an exceptional individual. You also have the emergence of other organizations that are maybe like have more specific concerns. So you have like, for example, Etherealize that have a more institutional focus and maybe more of a marketing focus than the EF, who seem to be, looking more towards the research kind of end of things. You have organizations like the PBS Foundation as well that are taking on very specific kind of concerns, such as like out of protocol innovations, research around PBS. They recently took over the maintenance of MEV Boost, which like 90% of Ethereum transactions go through. And then you're seeing things like Fabric, which is like all of the, rollouts and L2s coming together to figure out how to reduce fragmentation and work toward more interoperability. And so this seems to be painting a picture of a more sort of like polycentric governance within the Ethereum ecosystem, which is good. It also presents its own challenges, in terms of coordination, in terms of like marketing and branding for Ethereum as a whole. But I think everyone is cognizant of that. So I think that's not insurmountable. Consensys itself, has a role to play. Traditionally, Consensys has had a huge impact on Ethereum. It was one of the first companies created to support the Ethereum ecosystem and had a huge outsized impact. And, 10 years into the Ethereum project, I think Consensys has a pivotal role to play going forward. Consensys Network State specifically has a very strong focus on builders and founders who want to build on Ethereum and innovate in Ethereum in a way that makes it, as I said, relevant to people's everyday lives. So a lot of our focus on this kind of network state and creating a network of individuals and teams that support each other and have this like tightly knit network that's easy to navigate and it's very accessible. That's part of making Ethereum relevant. So we may not be the only one addressing that concern, but it's certainly something that we're going to take a role in going forward. That's not to say that the names that I've mentioned are the only people who are contributing to Ethereum. There are a huge number of teams that are all rowing in the same direction.
Okay, good. One of the other things I've been thinking about, I mentioned Web2, you mentioned Web2, and I'm going to mention again, particularly in fintech, in that one of the most exciting things for me back in reading the Ethereum white paper way back when was the concept of stablecoins and seeing how important that has become in the growth of blockchain and Web3. And it particularly over the last probably 2 to 3 years that been a lot more focus on that. And you can look at the whole traditional finance industry. You can look at credit card networks. You can look at institutional banking. You can look at retail banking, people's financial lives. Looking at what fintechs have been doing over the last 15 years to basically put a new skin on top of an old banking system. And that has brought us forward considerably. I much more enjoy using Revolut than I do using a Bank of Ireland app, right? 110%. A number of the conversations I've been having recently, Simon, is about connecting Web2, connecting traditional finance into stablecoin processes, into stablecoin networks. And we see a number of the big names out there that are working on this as well, with MasterCard, with Visa, with Circle, with Ripple, that are all working on this. I've got this thought that if I am a 3 to 4 to 5 year old fintech startup and seeing the writing on the wall, if I'm going to be doing anything in terms of putting payment flows in the hands of consumers and or enterprise, whether that's SMEs or institutions, I need to have a consideration in there for connecting to stablecoin flows. If I am looking to grow an ecosystem, a blockchain ecosystem, looking to reach out to those that are in the Web2 space, and it doesn't just have to be fintech, there's a number of other use cases here that are applicable where the natural stack selection that you end up doing when you're building something, or you're perhaps looking at how do we scale this at the Series A level, that I'm going to look to a blockchain ecosystem, look to building on blockchain, start connecting with some of these alternative payment mechanisms and alternative payment flows that have come to bear over the last number of years. In a roundabout way, the question is, when you're looking at Consensys Network State and thinking about that and thinking about bringing in new entrants into the community, are there specific pockets that you're looking at in Web 2 that you think are going to be relevant and that where an outreach may be helpful there?
In my team's remit, we're probably not looking probably not at that stage yet. Like we're still building out the core primitives. And broadly speaking, what we're doing is breaking things down into two very broad buckets. Like one is capital formation. The other one is like labor provision, which is essentially like connecting people so they can exchange goods and services and stuff like that. And capital allocation, which is also like a huge area that just has untold friction and is a massive barrier to entry for people who want to build. And so like those are the two kind of things that we're looking at. Moving beyond that, we're still in the exploration phase. This isn't me talking about Consensys. This is talking literally about my team. I think Consensys is, has a lot of conversations with various different institutions, which does touch upon stablecoin, how we can, leverage stablecoin for payments and also for yield. One interesting initiative recently has been the launch of the MetaMask card, which has caused a lot of excitement and which I say it is pretty cool. So you can like put a stable coin directly on your address on Linea, and then you can just spend it in the shop. What's cool is the rewards that back it as well. So I think, the rewards that you would get on, say, like a Visa credit card can be kind of cool, especially if you manage them properly. But what you can do in a MetaMask card when you have the whole of Web3 out there is even more cool. And so I think that's a huge space for innovation. And again, it bridges the gap between Web 2 and Web 3. Where it goes from there, I can only speculate about, but I can start to see how these old kind of interbank networks that have the merchant bank and the acquiring bank and a whole bunch of different connections between them, a lot of those banks now will start going, well, you know what, I could use stablecoin yields and I can bypass all of these and I can bypass all their fees. And if I do it properly, I can actually earn yield on my stablecoin reserves. Why am I not doing this? And so for the user, at the end, like you're in the shops, you're paying with your debit card or credit card, but behind the scenes, the infrastructure is slowly moving onto Web3 rails. And eventually, I hope my dream would be that a point of sale system, you present your credit card, it will just do a check to see if there's an Ethereum address associated with that credit card number and just do a stablecoin, like an on-chain payment from A to B. And that would be cool.
Yeah. No, I see that happening. That's where this is all going. And it's amazing that you're kind of dropping in some little hints of incentivization there, which is where this all comes back to, right? Which is how do you get the users on board? You provide them with a better mechanism. You provide them with a better point system, for example, that they can do more with, and I myself I mentioned Revolut before, but I started using that a lot more because they now have rev points where for every €2 that I spend, I get 1 rev point. And so, and you need to use that through either Apple Pay or by using a card. You can't just, send money out of your account. The rev points that I'm accumulating now will allow me to upgrade to business class on Aer Lingus when I fly back from New York in June, for example.
Yeah. I mean, so that's a really good example. So you mentioned how like using your rev points that you acquired just through like doing your shopping with your Revolut card allowed you to upgrade, your seat. That's kind of cool. You can't argue with that. Imagine what you can do with the entire Web3, DeFi, Lego, permissionless innovation and composability. Like you can do amazing things. And so imagine what sort of points and what sort of rewards you can unlock, especially when you think about like what people have been doing, the kind of like rewards that people have been getting through their on-chain transactions. Link that up now to just your everyday spending. And I think that's a pretty compelling offering. So if I can kind of like extrapolate that into like a much more speculative, long-term kind of imaginary future, like you mentioned like Revolut, right? And I think what's part of what has made Revolut so successful is its drive for financial primacy, where you open the Revolut app and you have everything you need. You want to take a loan, you get a loan. If you need travel insurance, you can get travel insurance. If you need to like open a savings account, investment account, you can access crypto, et cetera, et cetera. And so it's fantastic from a user's perspective. So I think that's sort of like where Ethereum needs to go. We need to start thinking more from a product perspective and like, how do we actually make this applicable and relevant and useful to people? So instead of opening up a wallet and just having like DeFi and a list of dApps or NFTs and a list of different stuff, it's just like, how do we think about opening up a dApp and get a loan, access insurance, open a savings and investment account. And then from there, you can kind of explore the options, but like making it actually relevant. And then from there, moving forward to things that people don't even realize are possible. So like manage my local community currency. Like community currencies should be far more ubiquitous than they are. How do I enter like rotating savings account or a rotating labor account? How do I, we can move forward into like what Web3 can really unlock at a local level. And I think that's really exciting. Again, it's sort of speculative and long-term and more in the future, but it is an exciting North Star to follow.
It is, and it's patterns, and it's seeing what's happening with stablecoins and seeing what the possibilities are. And the key word you mentioned there is composability, and that you can build on top of what came before in the Lego blocks. And what I was going to say as well, Simon, is that from the perspective of product building and that product mindset, that's what Consensys is there for, right? You're in the right seat to drive this.
Yeah, I think we are. I think that, Consensys is, first of all, like still very focused on supporting Ethereum. Like, I think the Pectra upgrade, what's it going live now in like 10, 20 minutes or something? We had like 35 people working on that, so we're still very focused on the infrastructure itself. But in terms of the actual, like lowering the barrier of entry to actually people using that infrastructure, I think that's what we're going to be focused a lot on over the next, the next decade. And maybe it's not directly, maybe it's indirectly through actually supporting builders and founders so that they can build the apps that are relevant to people. But I think that is definitely something that we will renew our focus on for sure.
Good. And what's the best way for people to learn more about the Consensys Network State?
The best way is to follow the Consensys account or follow my account, probably for the most up-to-date information. We will be making some announcements over the next few months. The agreement protocol, which is really exciting if you're into the more technical side of things, has gone live, and we'll be doing some marketing and announcements and some Twitter spaces and stuff. So follow me for more information there. And if you are a founder or you are an investor or you are working in the space, please get in touch. Just reach out to me directly and I'd be absolutely lovely to talk to you. So yeah, reach out directly to me. We can have a conversation.
Okay. And I'll share all your details in the show notes so everybody has them. The last question that I ask on this podcast, Simon, that I didn't ask you the first time around because we were taking more of a news review type approach to our conversation the first time. But when I do get into these types of interviews of folks, I do say, listen, the last question is, what is one thing that people would not expect to know about you?
What people would not expect to know about me. So there's a few things that people are often surprised by when it comes up in conversation. So one of them is that actually my background is not originally computer science or technology at all. My training was in Chinese medicine. And so originally I was specializing in acupuncture and other complementary therapies. And I had a clinic in Dublin. I trained in Beijing. And that's what my passion was. I
Wow.
loved it. Yeah. Until the GFC, the global financial crisis in 2008. So most of my clients were actually publicly funded by the health service and stuff. So complementary therapies and acupuncture was like the first thing they could. So that really harmed my business. And then it was just difficult to get business off the ground. And I think I started kind of going back to my other passion, which was technology. It's interesting. I think the global financial crisis had such a huge effect on me that I'm only starting to realize it now. And it's a big reason why I'm in crypto, because I saw the ugly side of how the global financial system works.
Oh,
So
yeah.
combining my passion with technology with, the personal impact that had at the time was probably what brought me here today. So that's, I think, one thing that surprises people though. And the other thing that surprises people is when they find out that I live in rural Ireland.
Yeah.
They're like, why do you live in rural Ireland?
Why
But
wouldn't you?
yeah. I mean, it's beautiful in the summer and it's peaceful and it's very quiet. It's a bit grim in the winter. I'll give you that. But
It's fine. It's fine. I absolutely love everything about it. So even, yes, the grim winters, the rain, the unexpected 4 seasons in one day that you get here in Ireland. But people do ask me from time to time why I live here. And that's what I tell them. I'm like, why wouldn't you want to live here? So, but listen, Simon, it's been a fantastic chat. Great having you back on the show. Thank you so much. We'll link all the details that I mentioned in the show notes that our listeners can follow on and get in touch with you. So thank you.
Always a pleasure, Pete. Thanks for having me on.
That does it for this week, folks. Thanks to Simon Brown for opening up his mind to help us figure out why he does what he does. Check out the show notes on moneyneversleeps.ie for all the relevant links to learn more about Simon and Consensys. If you like what you heard, please leave us a rating and or review on Spotify, Apple, or on moneyneversleeps.ie/rate. Thanks to Conan Brophy from Create Sound for mixing and editing this episode. Conan is an excellent media man to work with on your own podcast. As for me, I'm an early-stage startup investor in the next version of the internet, and I lead the Techstars Web3 Accelerator. There are plenty of links in the show notes on moneyneversleeps.ie on how to get in touch, so don't hesitate to reach out. Finally, till next time, thanks for listening. See ya!
Money never sleeps, pal.